I want to welcome everybody back. Make sure my lighting is right. Lighting is important. Here we go. And this morning, we're looking at a psalm that will look familiar, and that is very similar to Psalm 14. Psalm 53. I smile in terms of when I went to Psalm 14 to see what notes I had written in anticipation. I had then entitled Psalm 14, They Would Eat Up My People Like Bread. And Psalm 53, in reading it, I gave it the same title. But I then did my word count to find what are the middle words of Psalm 53. And the middle words are workers of iniquity who eat up my people. So that's the title for Psalm 53, a variation on a theme. The two key differences between Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 is one, the names of God. The earlier David Psalms tended to use God's name as Yud He Vav He. And this, the second of the five books in the Jewish counting. By the way, in the Latin counting, the Catholic counting, yesterday's Psalm 51, I should say, I think is the first of a second book. They have only three books. In any event, the key difference is the name for God. Here, the name for God is Elohim, repeated 7 times. And of course, we know that in the Bible, numerology is important, 7 being emphasis of a key message. The other key word that gets repeated in Psalm 53 is the word not. Ain. That'll get repeated 4 times in verse 2, 3, and 4. Here's the overview. The overview of Psalm 53 is that the person writing this psalm, identified as yesterday a maskil, an intellectual teaching of David, the person writing this psalm is remarkably negative. In fact, Bruegel, a Protestant, Broyles, a Protestant commentator, says this psalm is unique for its universal condemnation of humanity. Because here the psalmist will say, looking down, God sees that there is no one who is good, not even one. So one dimension of this short psalm, it's only, if you take out the inscription, verse 1, it's 6 verses, is that there's a sense of there is evil in the world, and yet there'll be a touch of hope. The key second difference, the first being the names of God, is what will take place in the second half of verse 5 and verse 6 is different than in Psalm 14. There's a difference of about 10 words, but a key turn. As a result, the classic commentators, who often like to find a historical setting for a psalm, like Rashi, 1040 to 1105 in France, he'll say that this is David's prophecy foreshadowing the destruction in Psalm 14 of the first temple, in Psalm 53 of the second temple, and the closing lines or line will be foreshadowing the building of the third temple. Another Orthodox commentator, not quite medieval and therefore not quite considered classic, is Malbim, and he will instead say that Psalm 53 is the rewriting of Psalm 14, in that he would say that Psalm 14 was written, the time of King David, and then there's that famous story we've seen before in Psalms where Sennacherib and the Assyrians have Jerusalem under siege, having conquered the 10 northern tribes and most of the Near East. And all of a sudden, in the midst of this siege, the king will say to Isaiah, "What should I do?" Isaiah says, "Don't do anything." And they wake up the next morning and the Assyrians have left. It's not clear why, if there was a plague among them, or as some say that there was a revolt, that the Assyrian army had to retreat to address elsewhere in the empire. But it's a miracle as described by Isaiah. And I think the book of Kings. In any event, Malbim says that's what this is referring to because of the change in verse 6. It's a rewriting of Psalm 14. There is one other possibility that classic Bible commentators will say, and that is that both of these psalms were riffs on a older, short psalm to God, psalm again being a poem to God, and that they're variations on a proto-psalm. With that, I will pull up Psalm 53. And read this psalm. Workers of iniquity, who may eat up my people? And again, those are the middle words, and at least it's my surmise that the middle is the bullseye. And here is what is moving this poem, that the writer sees enemies against the nation, against Israel. For the conductor on Machalat, a maskil of David, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They act corruptly, and they do abominable iniquity. No one does good. God from heaven looks down on humanity to see if there is any person of understanding who seeks after God. Each is turned away, altogether foul. No one does good, not even one. Do they understand those workers of iniquity who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon God? There they were terribly terrified, as no terror had ever been, for God has scattered the bones of those that encamp against you. You shame them, for God has rejected them. Who will give from Zion deliverance of Israel? When God turns the captivity of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be happy. And so some commentary now to go through it one more time, and then to end with the key question, which more and more is of importance, which is, what is the message for us? But to go through it now with some commentary, the word machalat, literally a machala is an illness. And machalat, some commentators say, is a musical instrument. This is what Rashi says, for instance, that is, whose sound is soothing. Meiri, commentator of 13th century, he added that it evoked mourning. Mourning because, as the Meiri understood it, this is a psalm mourning the destruction of the temple against Israel's enemies. The word naval, that's a good Hebrew word to know. Here I translated as fool, but I will just add in terms of sharing how different translations use a term. Benighted, that's JPS, or Robert Alter uses scoundrel. Clearly the naval here widely used is also fool. So they're not just a scoundrel, but there's a sense of them being unrefined and even, if you will, stupid. Now, here, there's going to be a contrast because the fool says in his heart, naval bilibo. So it's self-reflecting. This is what will drive the fool. What makes him a fool is that he says, there is no God. That, of course, is a key motif. The contrast between the fool, the evil person, who sees no accountability, there is no God, with the righteous who trust in God, who seek the presence of God. For the psalmist throughout, that's the contrast between good and evil to some degree, is the mindset of accountability and more reliability, the reliability of a just God. Because they say there is no God, they act corruptly and they do abominable iniquity. Now, that's clearly for emphasis. No one does good. Ein oseh tov. That phrase, ein oseh tov, will get repeated as a refrain in verse 4. God from heaven looks down on humanity to see if there is any person of understanding. Hayesh maskil, sechel, that's the word that we looked at yesterday. So maskil is intellectual understanding, one who uses reason, who has wisdom. And the definition is doresh et Elohim, who seeks after God. And here, there the image, if the fool is only looking inwardly, the image of God is looking down from heaven and coming down in this psalm to effect justice. Back to the psalm, verse 4, each is turned away, altogether foul. Ne'elahu. No one, now that refrain again, no one does good, ein gam echad, not even one. Now that can be understood, as I shared with you Broyle's comment, unique as universal condemnation, but the one who may be referred to is not the whole of humanity, although God is looking down al bnei Adam, on humanity, but it may be in reference simply to Israel's enemies. I do pause to acknowledge that this week the Torah reading is Noach, and we do have that same image of God in Noach, where God looks down and finds no good among them. And now the question in verse 5. I mentioned in my introduction to this psalm that there is no capitalization in Hebrew. And so in verse 5, the question is, who's speaking? Is it the psalmist or is it God? You see, in verse 3, God is looking down. That's an imagining that God is looking down. And the commentators are largely split, so that in this regard, most of the commentators have verse 5 as the Psalter speaking. That's true for ArtScroll, Robert Alter, Martin Cohen, Benji Siegel, Jewish Publication Society, but it's not the only voice, so that the Metsuda, an Orthodox commentary I like, and a Reform rabbi, Richard Levy. Metsuda and Richard Levy, in contrast, see this as God's reflection, and a capital M. I chose to translate it in that way, for I kind of like role play and bibliodrama. And here the psalmist is imagining God looking down from heaven, and in verse 5 saying, do they understand those workers of iniquity who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon God? That's a very strong verse. And again, I put it in quotation marks with a capital M, but I do pause to underscore how somebody reading a translation is always reading an interpretation. Verse 6 is where there's the key difference between Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. So let me tell you first how Psalm 14 reads. The second half of verse 5 reads, because so they eat up my people. They do not call upon God. Verse 5 now, because God Bedor Tzaddik exists in the generation of the righteous, which is the hint in Psalm 14 that they're not all bad. There are also righteous. And then it continues with the key difference is verse 6. One second. Atzat anita vishu, you may put to shame the counsel of the poor, ki Adonai machsehu, but Adonai is a refuge. And so in verse 14, the emphasis is God of justice. Verse 6 here, you may put to shame the counsel of the poor, now speaking to the evil, but Adonai is a refuge. In 14, there's the image of God who peers down from heaven, the all-seeing God, the God of crimes and misdemeanors, who is always present and cares for the poor. So in that regard, in this short psalm, Psalm 14, the trajectory is, don't fool yourself, fools. God is always watching and mindful of the poor. Here, and this is why you could see Malbim seeing this as in response to a battle. Verse 6 is totally different. There they were terribly terrified, as no terror had ever been. For God has scattered the bones of those that encamp against you. You shame them, for God has rejected them. So here, verse 6, the shift is God's vanquishing those who encamped against Israel. And in that regard, although these are short psalms, that one difference in verse 6 creates a different trajectory. They end the same way. Who will give from Zion deliverance of Israel? When God turns the captivity of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be happy. And that points to redemption in the future, a reoccurring theme in Psalms. Psalm 123, for instance, which we chant before grace after meals on Shabbat. God will return Zion, B'shuv Adonai Etzion, and from their crying it will turn to rejoicing. Similar image as in verse 7. Looking to the future, this is a psalm written amidst a people before an enemy, perhaps, as widely understood, before the destruction of the temple, a dispersed people. This is a psalm looking toward redemption, toward God delivering Israel from those who are its enemies, who are ultimately fools, for they fail to acknowledge that there is a God, and by failing to acknowledge God, they act abominably, none of them seeking to do good. Now, a couple of thoughts on how this psalm is relevant. So first, I'll start as I ended yesterday with Martin Cohen, and his focus is on what it means to be a fool, a naval, and he says a fool is a complete denier of God in all aspects, creator, revealer, and redeemer, and then challenges us as a modern to ask, in what sense do we believe in God? Richard Levy, who I mentioned earlier with the capital M, who for a long time was the head of Hebrew Union College, the Reform Seminary in Los Angeles, he says this psalm is a psalm of redemption, and if God could redeem Israel by enabling the recreation of the state of Israel, then there's hope for us as individuals too. We need not be in terror with whatever we may see as the hurdles in life, but with trust in the power of God, we have reason to trust in redemption. So, as here, the psalm culminates in deliverance of Israel. So, for Rabbi Richard Levy, literally, the recreation of the state of Israel did occur. It's the fulfillment of Psalm 53 and other psalms. And that only underscores reason in our own personal lives to be hopeful of our own respective goals of redemption. For me, a couple closing comments and then some of your reactions. This image of they eat who eat up my people as they eat bread, somehow I still find I'm drawn to as a disturbing image. You think of people eating bread, they eat bread to nourish themselves, to satisfy their own cravings, their own pet pleasures, and people are seen as objects to be used for, this is again the description of evil, for their own self-satisfaction, and to be dealt with again as simply an object. It is the dehumanization of an other, to treat them as a source of satisfaction, of nourishment, of a tool for another human being. And there's something, there's some translations that use the stronger word devour. They devour my people as they devour bread. But I like the kind of quotidian, the daily feeling of eating. So that there's this callousness in how they relate to other people, that they relate to people again as that which is to be used for self-satisfaction or self-need, no different than a piece of bread. And it's right here in the middle, literally the middle of this psalm. And that's what this psalmist is railing against. The Naval, the one who not only says in his heart, as a foundational worldview, there is no God, but it leads to this sense of callous crassness, of seeing everything, seeing other people as tools, as means, as objects for their own self-aggrandizement, their own pleasure, their own nourishment, whatever may be lacking in terms of their own sense of pride or power. So for me, I don't know, I relate to the focus on what, maybe I go back to Martin Cohen again today, on the question is, what is a fool? But rather than asking it about myself, and maybe I should return to myself, and I guess that is the right place. To what degree do we make other people objects versus that which is seen as reflections of God? Martin Buber, the great Bible scholar and philosopher, that was for him the key focus. He said, you find God in the between. When you relate to another person as if the person is not an object, but is a thou, fully self-contained, essential, and there's no, in relating to another person, there is no ulterior motive other than to commune. He said, in that communion, that's where you experience the divine. But most of the time, he said, we relate to other people as objects. He called it I, it, and that's neutral. Because when you get into an Uber, these are the old days, when you went to a restaurant and spoke to a waiter, those people were there to serve you, and they were on some level an it, meaning there wasn't an intimate coming together. But even there, at best, it was untouched by the sense of the dignity of the other. It's the lack of dignity of the other that makes them no different than a piece of bread. There only to serve. And so for me, for us, maybe this is a challenge to ask, to what degree do we provide, or how do we relate to the other? Do we see the other as containing a dignity, and that we have a quality of accountability in how we relate to others? For to fail to do so, here the psalmist says, to treat others like a piece of bread is ultimately to unravel into the emphasis of acting corruptly, doing abominable iniquity, with the re-emphasis of being in the mindset, no one does good. So no one does good might be not just God looking down and saying no one does good. This is what the fool says. No one does good. Here's the play on no one does good. It's not clear if it's what the fool is thinking in verse 2, no one does good, or if it is God's judgment. And maybe they go together, meaning the fool says no one does good, therefore cynically it doesn't matter how I treat others. And it's also simultaneously God's judgment, or, if you will, the psalmist's judgment. And that's the ambiguity of the first time no one does good in verse 2. It's ambiguous as whether it's the fool or God, and as in most cases of poetry, it's often both. With that, I will now take off this psalm so that I can see everybody. It's nice to now have all of you on my screen, and to take just a few minutes to see in Psalm 53, what touched you? In what ways does this psalm feel relevant? All right, Vivian, nice. I'll you have to unmute. There you go.
I know this is, I don't know if this is appropriate or not to say, but this is relevant to me in an unexpected way. I don't usually think of myself as reading these texts with a literal, practical, political message, but I have to say the thought that it's all right to act with iniquity because everybody does it is one that is around and about in our society. And suppose I just leave it at that, and that it draws our attention to the wrong of that.
Well, just to underscore that, Vivian, in terms of a key theme of this psalm, and that is, it's the one phrase that gets repeated twice, the only phrase, in verse 2 and verse 4, in characterizing the evil that's brewing, that it's no one does good. And
no one does any different. Yeah.
And with the ambiguity of both, of that's what the fool says, doesn't matter what I do because then nobody else does any good. And simultaneously, God, if you will, saying, how, and the Psalter, this is not right, that no one does good. So there's that sense that that's resonating here as a key motif, and problematically so. Yeah. Short psalm, amazing how rich it is. Marion, go ahead.
I kind of went where Vivian went, but in verse 5, I was kind of reading it that we're being so bombarded with messages to go in a different direction. Whether you're Republican, Democrat, you're being bombarded to go somewhere else. And so it was, who's taking my people away, and they're not even thanking God? Who is, in terms of religion, were there people at the time that were trying to say, don't follow that God, come with me, go elsewhere. And so that's kind of where I went, that we're being drawn and we're not being thankful.
So that's an important motif of people being manipulated, drawn, and people not being thankful. You underscore with your comment what is also very much part of this psalm. I did a dotted line between verses 4 and 5, meaning the line you just pointed to seems to be a dividing piece. Do they understand those workers of iniquity? And it starts with verse 2, calling them fools. And then verse 5 is, do they understand those workers of iniquity, implying they don't understand. And that there's a sense that people, by failing to understand, to be thoughtful, to be grounded in values that are enduring, are going to be manipulated. So that the nature of manipulation is the failure of understanding. That's, again, the opening of verse 2, which is the first three. So that would divide this psalm right in half. 2, 3, and 4, beginning with the fool. 5, 6, and 7, they who don't understand. A closing comment, and then we'll pull together today. I'm just gonna, anybody else? Let me pull together today.
Marvin wants to say something.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I was thinking of the fact, the example you give of acknowledging a server in a restaurant.
Yeah.
And I make the point of always asking the person their name if they don't have it. But I'm thinking of the times we're living in right now, where every person you meet is a probable conveyor of a virus that is lethal.
Yeah.
This time that we're living in is effectively driving us apart.
Yeah.
And it is essentially doing to the entire public what this psalm says not to do.
Yeah.
The psalm would want us to treat people other than like bread.
Right.
But we are afraid of other people. We wear masks. We turn away if they're too close.
So that's well said. And if you don't know others in the group, Marvin is a professor of biology. So I free associate to that, Marvin, as you focus on a time of virus and of that which can only be seen with the microscope, and physical distancing.
Yes.
Of staying 6 feet apart does literally put somebody at arm's length, beyond arm's length. And by putting somebody at arm's length physically, there's a natural, what I've experienced, recoiling out of fear of the other.
Yes.
And making the other a threat just unconsciously, because they're an unknown. So, and that can lead to, as you acknowledge, Marvin, that can lead to making people into objects to be feared rather than intimates to connect with. And
Right.
So in our time more than ever, Psalm 53 has a certain tension of how do we, when we're physically distancing from strangers, how do we see the stranger as a friend, as somebody worth honoring, as an expression of God's creation? So
I think of this psalm as saying to us, when times return to normalcy, so to speak,
yeah,
remember this psalm. Remember what it says about treatment of others.
thank you. So I am just delighted by our ability to connect and relate to the Psalms. And in ways, I'm going back to Vivian's comment, we read with the lenses of a moment, and to some degree, we don't even unpack for ourselves, let alone publicly, what it is that we're reacting to. But these Psalms are dramatically resonant. for me at this time.
Yeah, that's true.
Next week we have 54, 55, and 56. I had last week off so I could get ahead a little bit. And I'll be talking next week about tear catchers, Psalm 56. Bottles like this. And the source of the notion of perfume bottles and why they're shaped the way they are, and its origins in Psalm 56 specifically. You'll find out. That's a teaser for a week from today. But I look to see you on Tuesday when we will be doing next week Psalm 54. So have a good day. Again, thank you for coming together.
Will it
Are
be?
we doing?
Thank
are we
you very
doing
much,
Kaddish?
Rabbi.
Yes, let me conclude with Kaddish, which traditionally was the prayer said not for mourning, but in the aftermath of study for hope making. And I invite you who are saying Kaddish with me to do so. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah,
Amen.
v'yoma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute, b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, b'agalau v'zman kari v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehi shmei Rabbah mevarach, le'olam me'omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal, shemei dekudsha barichu, le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechamata, damiran v'yoma v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Osei shalom b'mrumav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Again, a thanks to all for participating. I will add OCCSP, Orange County Community Scholar Program, at 10 o'clock, which is why we were at 9 o'clock this week. But at 10 o'clock has probably the premier woman teacher of the Zohar, Melila Helfner, who lives in Jerusalem, teaches at Hebrew University. She's the teacher at 10 o'clock at occsp.org. Have a good day and enjoy.